Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I would like to first thank our partners that joined us for this event this evening, Harvard Club of Washington, D.C., and also our affiliate, Columbia Club of New Jersey, and their members for being with us. It's a privilege for me to introduce Stephen Biddle, Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, to discuss Afghanistan and how, after 20 years, we arrived at this point. Professor Biddle is a member of the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and adjunct senior fellow for defense policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has served on the Defense Department's Defense Policy Board, on General David Petraeus's Joint Strategic Assessment Team in Baghdad in 2007, as a senior advisor to the Central Command Assessment Team in Washington from 2008 to 2009, as a member of General Stanley McChrystal's Initial Strategic Assessment Team in Kabul in 2009, and on a variety of other government advisory panels and analytical teams. Before joining Columbia in the fall of 2018, he was professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University and has held the Elio Root Chair in Military Studies at the U.S. Army War College, the Strategic Studies Institute, and the Roger Hertog Senior Fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations. He holds A.B., MPP, and Ph.D. degrees, all from Harvard. He's married to Professor Tammy Davis Biddle of the U.S. Army War College, has one daughter, and lives in Manhattan, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. We are all ears, Professor. And welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It's nice to be able to play some role in bringing together my two favorite Ivy League institutions. In my undergraduate years at Harvard, I was captain of the fencing team, and I regret to report that Columbia beat us soundly all 4 years of my undergraduate education on the fencing script. That wasn't quite as bad as if we'd lost to Yale 4 times in a row. That would have been, grounds for ritual suicide, I think. Fortunately, we beat Yale all 4 years, but we did lose to Columbia, which makes it a somewhat strange experience being here on the faculty now. But here I am, and I'm delighted to be able to speak to alumni from both fine institutions. So I was asked to address the war in Afghanistan and how, after investing well over $1 trillion, 2,461 lost American lives, 50 to 70,000 lost Afghan police and soldiers' lives, we could possibly have lost this war. Now, I should start at the beginning by laying my own cards on the table in doing this. I supported the war. I supported the war consistently from its beginning to its end. I opposed the withdrawal, both the final withdrawal under President Biden and especially the, in my view, more problematic withdrawal announcement by the Trump administration in 2020. I know that's an unpopular position. And I suspect that people who played some role in advising and designing the war effort, as I did, are unpopular messengers for that position. But you asked me to come and speak about Afghanistan, so I'm going to do my best to do that and to explain why a war effort that I supported failed, and in particular, why I don't think it was inevitable that the war should have failed. Now, anytime you're talking about a big, complicated, complex social science outcome like a lost war, there are lots of contributing causes, some of them quite remote. You could trace a line of causation to American failure in Afghanistan, if you're so inclined, all the way back to the changes ongoing in Afghan society prior to the Soviet invasion in 1979. Many of the causes of failure are much more proximate than that. And what I would particularly like to do this evening is to focus on one contributing factor to that failure that is substantially more proximate than social change prior to the Soviet invasion, but which I think is unusually salient as a cause of failure and is unusually critical for this issue of, was it inevitable that we were going to fail? Did it have to be this way? And in particular, what I want to focus on this evening is a series of, in my view, badly mismanaged responses to the dilemma of responding to threats to American security that are real but limited. Because Afghanistan posed threats to American security that were real, for most of the 20-year history of this war, American presidents were very reluctant to just wash their hands, walk away from this situation, and allow threats that were real to become malignant. But because those threats were limited, no American president from 2001 to 2021 has been willing to send 500,000 American soldiers to Afghanistan to drive the Taliban out of the country militarily. In these kind of situations where we've spent 20 years groping around trying to find some real but limited means for waging a war in pursuit of ends that are real but limited, the danger is that you end up locked into a grinding stalemate in which you end up finally losing expensively rather than cheaply, which is, of course, what we did. The more appropriate response to this dilemma, how to cope with interests that are too important to walk away from, but not important enough to warrant massive investment to resolve, is compromise negotiated settlement to the war, okay, in which long before 2021, at least as far back as 2011, if not sooner, the better strategy would have been pursue some sort of compromise power sharing deal that ends the war with a lot less than we had hoped for, but a lot more than we have gotten now. I believe that negotiated settlement was in fact possible in Afghanistan as recently as 2020, if not later than that. Our failure, in my view, to prioritize the pursuit of a negotiated settlement to the war for at least the last 10 years, and to design the conduct of the military campaign around a negotiating strategy for bringing about a settlement to the war in which the military and the political elements of a negotiating strategy were brought together, is, in my view, largely responsible for the horrible outcome that we now have sitting in our laps. But if you buy the argument that I'm going to lay out to that end, these were choices, these were decisions. These were decisions that the US government made that could have been made differently, that we didn't have to choose this way. And in my view, if we had chosen differently, we would have gotten a very different outcome than we observe now. Not, Switzerland and the Hindu Kush, right? Not some, Valhalla in South Asia, as former Secretary of Defense Gates famously once put it, but in which there would have been some kind of power sharing resolution that would have respected America's national security interests in this conflict to a much greater degree, and would have been vastly better for Afghanistan and for Afghans than the situation that we now observe. And therefore, I think it's important to understand what was possible and what wasn't with respect to negotiating a settlement to this war. I'm struck by the degree to which the contemporary public debate over Afghanistan pays almost no attention to a very serious ongoing negotiating process. So I want to talk a little bit more about it this evening. So what I'm going to do with the bulk of my time is I'm going to try and unpack this argument and explain why I think this was the superior route to have taken, and then speak just very briefly to some speculations about why I think the government didn't choose what I think would have been a better course. So let's start with the issue of US interest in the conflict, and this claim that I've advanced a moment ago that they were real, but that they were limited, and that this set up a variety of strategic dilemmas that I will turn to next before I then talk to why we didn't negotiate the settlement that I think we should have negotiated. So the United States has many things and has had many things that it wants for Afghanistan. We would like the country to be prosperous. We would like its minorities' rights to be respected. We would like its women to be educated. We would like its infant mortality rate to decline. We would like its economy to expand. We would want these things for any country in the international system. So surely we would want them for Afghanistan too. Normally speaking, though, we don't pursue this broader penumbra of aspirations for countries in the international system by killing people in the name of the state, right? When you talk about things that might, in principle, warrant the making of war to bring about, this larger array of aspirations shrinks down to a much smaller list of what are in this business sometimes called vital national security interests, defined somewhat circularly as things for which you might want to wage a war. And they're basically the two US interests that the Obama administration articulated way back in 2009, that Afghanistan not become a base by which terrorists could attack us, and that Afghanistan not be a base for destabilizing its region. And that especially means the nuclear armed part of the region that is right across the border from Afghanistan, Pakistan. Of those two interests, Afghanistan not become a base by which a terrorist could attack us, and Afghanistan not become a source of instability for the region. The second one is the only one that's ever been terribly important. The first one is the one everyone talks about. The second one is the one that matters. I mean, Afghanistan may very well now become a base from which al-Qaeda could attack the United States now that the Afghan government has collapsed. But so could Somalia. So could Niger. So could Yemen. So could the Caucasus. There are dozens of places around the world where al-Qaeda isn't in large numbers now, but might be in large numbers in the future, from which they might be able to plot an attack on the United States. Right? There's nothing globally unique about Afghanistan as a place where al-Qaeda could set up bases and attack us. If the way we're going to solve the problem of al-Qaeda in general is we're going to send 100,000 American soldier military missions everywhere al-Qaeda isn't now, but might be in the future, right? That's not a viable strategy for dealing with al-Qaeda. On the other hand, whereas Afghanistan isn't unique as a base for attacking us, it is literally geographically unique as a base for destabilizing Pakistan. Right? It's right on the other side of an infamously porous international border in the form of the Durand Line. The Pashtun ethnic group is particularly associated with the Taliban insurgencies, a cross-border population that has more members on the Pakistani side of the border than the Afghan side of the border, and that population has regularly entertained separatist ambitions vis-a-vis the government in Islamabad. And Pakistan is in the midst of its own civil war, which has been waging many years now with fortunes that wax and wane, but at the moment are waning. If Pakistan's insurgency succeeds, and if Pakistan's insurgency topples the government in Islamabad, Pakistan is a nuclear weapons state with a large and rapidly expanding arsenal of usable, deliverable, intact nuclear weapons, and dozens of active militant groups within the country that mean ill towards the government of Pakistan, mean ill towards its neighbor in India, but also mean ill towards us and our allies in the West. In fact, if I look around the world, the only place that I think is even remotely plausible as a venue in which terrorists might someday get their hands on nuclear weapons is Pakistan in the event of state collapse and a breakup of the Pakistani military and intelligence service along factional lines. That is a globally unique threat to the United States, but it's an indirect consequence of potential failure, now realized failure in Afghanistan. For failure in Afghanistan to lead to destabilization of the region in a way that causes nuclear weapons to fall into the hands of a terrorist that then deliver it against targets in the United States requires a whole chain of uncertain events breaking badly with respect to US interests. The first of those has now broken badly, right? The government in Kabul has fallen. That then needs to lead to base camp establishment for the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP that's waging war against Islamabad in northeastern Afghanistan. That is now beginning. and is fairly well underway, but is not fully mature. That still needs to happen. That needs to catalyze state collapse in Pakistan. State collapse in Pakistan needs to lead to the breakup of the army and the intelligence service. That needs to lead to the loss of containment of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal, which needs to fall into a terrorist hands, which has to have the ability to deliver it against the target of the United States. Right. Now, all of those events would have to break badly for this worst case scenario I talked about a minute ago to be realized. Now, I don't know what the individual probabilities are, so I can't give you a 6 significant digit estimate of the compound probability of all those things happening. That probability went up with the failure of the government in Kabul, but I would imagine that it's surely way less than 1 in 2 and probably way less than 1 in 10. It's not, however, 0. And if it happens, it's an extraordinarily grave source of damage and destruction and danger to American national interests, lives, and property. And I think when American senior elected officials look at this problem, they look at that and say, if I let that happen on my watch, I will go down in history as the president who made the single worst foreign policy decision in the history of the Republic. But what are the odds that that's going to happen? And that leads to this problem of the interest set in Afghanistan being seen by American presidents and by the American foreign policy community more broadly as being real, something that they're reluctant to just walk away from and ignore and run the social science experiment and see if all these compound probabilities work out in this 1 in 10 chance, 1 in 20 chance, 1 in 100 chance actually happens, right? It's a scary thing to say, I'm just going to wash my hands of this problem and let happen whatever happens. But because it seems very unlikely, although the interest, the threat is real, it's limited. Nobody in the United States, not George W. Bush, not Barack Obama, not Donald Trump, and certainly not Joseph Biden, wanted to send 500,000 soldiers to Afghanistan to drive the Taliban out of the country and at least ensure that the first step in this process didn't go badly. The result of that, most notably and explicitly in the Obama administration's fall 2009 review, but really in the entire long tortured history of the American involvement in this war, has been this long process of groping forward and trying to find some real but limited military campaign where the costs and the benefits would seem commensurate with real but limited interests in the country. And the problem with real but limited military means is that they frequently lose expensively rather than losing cheaply. The famous Prussian 19th century military philosopher Karl von Clausewitz famously said, no one seeking to cross a wide chasm would begin by jumping halfway. These kinds of limited military means in American practice typically work. The way they stay limited, right, the way they reduce the scale of US involvement is they offload to an indigenous ally, the Afghan police and army, the responsibility for the casualty-intensive, cost-intensive, difficult grinding part of the war that we don't want to do, the infantry on the ground. There was this brief reinforcement in 2009 where the United States went up to 100,000 troops. That surge under the Obama administration only lasted 18 months. The great majority of the war, and all of it since 2011, has been a gradual process of withdrawal. The logic in that withdrawal is we're going to hand the war off to the Afghans and let them fight it. After all, it's their country, right? Why should we be fighting for them? We should let them fight for themselves. What we will do is we will equip them. We will train them. We will advise them. We will arm them. We will fly airstrikes in support of their forces. We'll provide medical support and we'll provide intelligence information, but we'll let them do the hard, dirty work on the ground. If we are good Clausewitzians, Clausewitz's most famous cliche is that war is a means to political ends. That the purpose of war is to bring about a political outcome. All the fighting is just the way you get there. And if politics is as important to war and its conduct and its outcomes as Clausewitz says it is, then it should matter a lot what the political interests of the combatants are. And the fundamental problem the United States has had with the strategic solution that we adopted to respond to this problem of real but limited threats is that we offloaded most of the military labor of the war onto an ally whose interests are systematically not ours. And in fact, this is normally the case in counterinsurgency. The United States' interest in this conflict is that the Taliban insurgency be defeated. The primary interest of our Afghan allies, however, was different than that. The interest calculus of Afghanistan and dozens of weakly governed states suffering internal violence of the kind we see in Afghanistan, but not limited to Afghanistan, is grounded in the problem of weak political institutions for adjudicating conflict between armed elites. In Afghanistan, as in South Vietnam, as in Iraq, as in Somalia, Yemen, Niger, Mali, other places of that kind around the world, there is no judicial system that can adjudicate conflict between multiple armed members of the elite. We colloquially refer to these folks as warlords. There are somewhere between 12 and 24 armed militia leaders loosely associated with the government that were prominent members of the Afghan political elite from 2001 until 2021. The courts were in no position to reach a judgment against one of them, impose a settlement, and force them to follow it. The police couldn't adjudicate conflicts and impose a settlement. The legislature couldn't adjudicate conflicts and impose a settlement. In a setting like Afghanistan, where the political institutions are too weak to adjudicate conflicts between multiple armed members of the elite and enforce settlements, the only way you can get reasonable political stability, how do you prevent these people from going to war with each other over their disagreements over control of customs revenue or smuggling of gems and minerals or opium and narcotics trafficking? How do you adjudicate, how do you prevent them from going to war with each other and bringing down the state in internal chaos? Classically, the way that's done in these kinds of weakly institutionalized political settings is by maintaining what is sometimes referred to as an internal double balance of power, where the balance of armed violence potential among warlords is roughly collinear with the balance of rents that they're extracting from the society and the economy for the benefit of their followers. If I have twice as many fighters as my neighboring warlord, and I'm getting twice as much of the customs skim from the Torkham Gate international border crossing, then we're both kind of okay with this arrangement and internal order is maintained. If I have twice as many followers and he's getting twice as much revenue, now we've got trouble. And that trouble can kill the president of Afghanistan long before the Taliban will. For Hamid Karzai and then later for Ashraf Ghani, on the average Wednesday morning, far and away the most immediate threat to their lives, the lives of their family, and the lives of their followers was not that someday this Taliban insurgency might take over. It's that tomorrow morning, an alliance of warlords who don't like the settlement they're getting marches on the capital, takes over the government, and kills me tomorrow. That's an entirely plausible scenario and far more immediate than any kind of threat that the Taliban posed. So you then ask, what is the most immediate, dangerous threat to this internal double balance of power that's required in order to get political stability in these kinds of societies? And the answer is it's the biggest militia in the country, which is the National Army and the National Police Force. If I am a warlord militia leader, I cannot afford to sit back and wait while an American-created national military force that starts at 0 in 2001 is going to eventually grow to 300,000 security force providers. If I just sit back and allow that institution to be well-trained, professionalized, militarily proficient, well-equipped, and American-advised, how long is it going to be before this 500-pound gorilla rolls me up and decides to disarm my followers, throw me in the gulag, evict my family, right? Way too dangerous. And the result is, long before a national military instrument like that could ever be created, an alliance of warlords would have marched on the Capitol, murdered Hamid Karzai, and put an end to this thing. And the result is Hamid Karzai therefore understood from the beginning that that could not be allowed to happen, and that institution must not be allowed to become that kind of force. So how do you keep the national military from rolling up all these warlord militias, and most importantly, from doing it in a way, from being clear to the militias themselves that it's not going to be able to do that? And the answer classically in these kinds of political settings is cronyism and corruption. Right? Cronyism ensures that this national military instrument is not going to go off the rails and go rolling up warlords that they're not supposed to, because all the senior commanders are related to me, Hamid Karzai, by birth or by marriage, or I served with them in exile, or they were part of the beginning of my political career, or lots of other reasons that give me personal reason to trust them, but are rarely correlated with disinterested technical military expertise. The other way regimes in these kinds of states prevent the military from blowing up the internal balance of power and causing an immediate warlord alliance to march on the capital is corruption. You buy the loyalty of the people with the guns, and you tie them to the militias by corrupt revenue streams that they share with the militias, that give the militias reason to trust that the military isn't going to turn on them. Now, these kinds of techniques are actually very good at maintaining internal stability in weakly institutionalized political settings. The rate of coup d'etat in the international system has been falling for 2 generations as these techniques have become more and more widespread and better known among the governments of these kinds of countries. The problem with them is not that they don't do what they're designed to do. They're designed to maintain an internal political balance of power, and they're quite good at that. The problem is they're quite bad at what Americans mistakenly think is their primary purpose, which is dealing with outside threats, this Taliban insurgency. Because cronyism and corruption systematically produces a military that isn't very threatening to the warlords, but it's also not all that threatening to the Taliban. Right? It systematically saps the combat motivation of the soldiers in the ranks. About the 3rd or 4th time that we go out on patrol, and my platoon leader, my company commander, and my battalion commander are all much more interested in paying back the loans they took out to buy their command positions than they are in varying the patrol routes. So we get hit every time at exactly the same IED hotspot. They've sold all the fuel for the up-armored Humvees that are supposed to provide the armor protection and the fire support, so the vehicles can't move. The fuel is all in the black market. The spare parts are all in the black market. The tires are all in the black market. Our own water has been sold. The unit is at half strength because half of us are ghost soldiers that appear on the rolls so that their pay goes to the commander, but they're not actually in existence out in the field, and therefore we're constantly under strength. Right, about the 3rd or 4th time you go out on patrol under these conditions and get schwacked at the same IED hotspot, the troops start figuring maybe a better idea is to sit here on the checkpoint, right, behind these fortifications and all these HESCO barriers where it's relatively safe. These kinds of politically driven institutional features of the security forces in these kinds of political settings systematically sap combat motivation and create a military that doesn't just collapse, but it's unable to drive an insurgency out of the country militarily on the battlefield. The best it can do is maintain a slowly decaying stalemate, which they did. For all of its shortcomings and travails, all of its corruption, all of its cronyism, all of its combat motivation problems, the Afghan military, suffered 50 to 70,000 casualties waging this war, right? It's not like they didn't care enough about their country to fight. And they also maintained a rough stalemate. The Obama administration ended the US combat role in Afghanistan in 2014, another underappreciated fact in the public square, right? The American troops had not been out on patrol on the ground in Afghanistan, for 7 years. For those 7 years, this challenged, difficult, problematic institution, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, was holding the line. They were gradually losing territory, but they were maintaining a rough stalemate. If we had just left this on autopilot forever, right? If we had done what some voices were advocating and just stay forever, right? Personally, I'm not a big fan of the forever wars phrase, but if we had just decided this is going to be a forever war and we're just going to stay there in perpetuity, eventually they would have lost everything because they were continuously but slowly losing ground for that 7-year period after the US combat role on the ground ended, and our presence became that of advising and performing airstrikes and doing occasional special forces raids against high-value targets. Eventually, that slowly decaying stalemate would have decayed all the way to a Taliban march into Kabul, but it would have taken a long time at the rate it was going, another 5 to 10 years probably at least, but eventually we would have lost. Therefore, at least since 2014, if not sooner, the realistic end states, given this problem of real but limited interest, yielding this low commitment strategy of fly airstrikes, arm, equip, and train and advise an Afghan military to do the hard work, where that strategy was leading was one of the other two places. Either we negotiate a settlement to end the war, or we lose outright eventually. Even if we kept the money flowing, even if we kept the 8,400 troops in the country that the Obama administration left office with, sooner or later we would have lost outright. The only alternative to that was to negotiate a settlement. Which brings us to this question of the settlement, which is what the conversation in America should have been all about. It just amazes me how little discussion there is about the negotiating process, because that's what this war has been all about for at least 7 and probably the last 10 years of our involvement. Now, there are plenty of people who argue that the settlement was impossible, right? This was a pipe dream. The cliche, right, is that the Americans have the watches, but the Taliban has the time, right? This is a decaying stalemate. The Taliban surely know that if they wait this out, they'll get the whole loaf. So why negotiate and compromise in the meantime? I don't think this was a pipe dream. I think this was real and it could have produced something. Why might one believe that? And there are a number of, I think, compelling reasons to believe that these negotiations were real and could have actually gone somewhere. The first is simply the fact that the Taliban were participating at all. When an insurgent group begins negotiations with a government, normally what happens is it creates centrifugal forces within their own organization and creates factional schisms, because there will always be hardliners who oppose negotiating with the great Satan and others who want to. And in these kinds of settings, the hardliners often break and become enemies of the insurgency. And that is exactly what happened in Afghanistan. Right? Some of you, I'm sure, have been hearing a lot about the Islamic State Khorasan group recently, the outfit that set off the bomb at Hamid Karzai International Airport that killed the 13 American Marines and vastly larger numbers of innocent Afghans. That group is essentially a splinter group from the mainline Taliban that broke away because they opposed negotiations with the hated Americans. If the Taliban had no intention of a settlement, if they didn't care about this and they just figured we're going to fight this thing out to the end, why start negotiating with the Americans and risk the formation of an enemy that is now the most lethal opponent of their own government in Kabul and was killing them in significant numbers even before the Kabul government fell. The Taliban were taking real risks, which got realized in the form of a breakaway military group that is now their enemy. They could have obviated all of that and escaped this entire problem by just saying no. It would have been the easiest thing in the world. Take the propaganda coup, issue a public statement saying these weak, lily-livered, cowardly Americans are crawling to us on their hands and knees, asking for a settlement. Ha! We are far more powerful than that. We are winning this war and we will win. We are not going to talk to them. I mean, the speech writes itself, right? That would have been the easy thing to do if they weren't actually serious about this. They didn't do that. There were reasons why they didn't do that, right? They surely realized that if they wanted to play this thing out for another 10 years, yes, they could, not anticipating at that time that the United States was going to bug out when it did, right? Circa, roll the clock back to say 2015 when these talks were getting serious. They surely realized that they could play this string out, but that, as far as they knew, could take another 10 years of grinding, stalemated warfare. That's imposing cost on them that they could avoid if they settle the war in the meantime. Moreover, that prospective future, who knows how many more years of grinding, slowly changing, stalemated warfare with the government, had a substantial probability of killing any given Taliban leader in any one of those years. There are a lot of pros and cons of the American drone campaign that we were using to target leadership in the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but one advantage it had, whatever you think of it overall, is it substantially reduced the benefits of protraction to the Taliban by creating a meaningful chance that in any given year along the way, if they play this thing out and stall, an American drone could kill them personally. We killed 6 of the last 7 Al-Qaeda operations directors. We killed Osama bin Laden. We killed Mullah Mansour, Mullah Omar's successor as the leader of the Taliban. Right? If all the Taliban had to do is look around and watch the disappearance rate of senior leaders and conclude that maybe we're not going to negotiate some surrender instrument, right? We're not just going to give in to the Americans and to the Afghan government, but maybe it's worth seeing what's on the table. Maybe the compromise deal that we get might look better than continuing to wage this war for 10 more years, taking our chances that we may not personally live to see the end of it. And maybe if we negotiate a deal, we'll have some access to the international aid flow that has caused the Afghan economy to grow by a factor of 5 since 2001. Right? There are reasons to believe that a rational Taliban who had an objectively accurate understanding of where the war was and where the war was going might have made a rational decision to say, we're not giving away the store, right? This settlement's going to have to look pretty favorable to us, but let's see what's on the table from these Westerners. Maybe there's a deal we can live with. And I think there would have been a deal that we could have lived with. It surely would have involved legalizing the Taliban as a political actor in Afghanistan. It would have involved some guaranteed set-aside in a power-sharing deal of ministries or parliamentary seats or both. It would have involved some changes to the Afghan constitution to make it less favorable to groups that we would prefer to protect, especially Afghan women and secondarily Afghan ethnic minorities. But in exchange, the Taliban would have laid down their arms, broken with Al-Qaeda for real, perhaps, ended the war and ended the threat that the war is the destabilization that kicks Pakistan over the edge into state collapse. Now, the talks were all about how much of a set aside of offices, how much power sharing goes to the Taliban. Who knows where all that would have come out, but I guarantee that it would have come out better than where we are right now. Wholesale 100% capture of the entirety of the government by the Taliban and substantial incentives for the Taliban to call in to answer the IOU calls they're getting from their former allies in the Pakistani insurgency to allow them to set up base camps on the Afghan side of the Durand line to facilitate the counterinsurgency campaign against the Pakistani government in Islamabad. I think a settlement would have been better than that. So if a settlement was possible, nothing in this life is guaranteed, right? So, but if it was, if you buy the argument so far, at least provisionally, that it might have been possible, and it would have been better, surely, than what we have now, why did we not get it? And I think there were a number of reasons why I think we didn't. The first was we systematically failed to understand the basic tenets of negotiation theory, which is in a leverage-poor environment, you need to husband your leverage and use it systematically and conditionally to give other parties in the talks incentives to move in your direction. The two things the Taliban wanted the most from the United States in these talks was withdrawal of our military forces and a promise of post-war aid. We gave away half of it for nothing. The Trump administration Doha deal in February of 2020 promised a total withdrawal of US forces in exchange for no Taliban guarantee that they were going to end the war. The Taliban made a series of modest promises. They would break with Al-Qaeda and would prevent the territory of Afghanistan to be used by terrorists. They would begin negotiations with the Afghan government, a couple of other lesser conditions, but all of which they then violated. Right? They did not meet the deadline for beginning talks with the Afghan government, and the intelligence community in the United States has stated with high confidence that the Taliban has not, in fact, broken with Al-Qaeda or prevented territory under their control from being used by terrorist organizations. But in exchange for promises that the Taliban didn't even keep, we gave away half of our bargaining leverage at a stroke, and we didn't have much leverage to begin with. Secondly, our leverage needed to be used not only vis-a-vis the Taliban, but vis-a-vis the Ashraf Ghani government in Kabul. Right? It was clear that the Taliban were going to insist on a provisional government in which the elected president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, would not be allowed to serve, because they knew that any deal was going to legalize them as political actors, and they wanted to succeed politically against the opposition they expected to encounter after the war ended, Ghani and his people. So they wanted to humiliate Ghani and get him off the stage. Ghani wanted none of this. He refused to leave. The United States needed to use our leverage to compel Ghani to agree to leave. There are all sorts of ways we could have done that, with manipulation of our aid flow and with threats to leave if he didn't leave, which we could have begun to execute in order to establish their credibility. We did not do that. So our negotiating behavior was unsound. That hurt. The deeper reasons for our failure to prioritize negotiation and realize it, I think, lie in a combination of failure to understand that wars of this kind typically end in negotiated settlements, and in very poor civil-military relations within the US government. So going back at least as far as the Obama administration fall 2009 review, American presidents decided that the military was trying to box them in, that senior military officers and secretaries of defense were more concerned with their reputation and with winning this war militarily on the ground than they were with serving American interests in the view of the Obama administration. And as a result, so for example, now President, then Vice President Biden in the fall 2009 review, way back in 2009, was opposed to surging forces into Afghanistan and wanted a small footprint, minimal presence, counterterrorism only posturing, which we didn't seek to support the Afghan government. We just wanted enough military assets to go strike individual terrorist targets when we find them. I personally think that was an extremely ill-advised military plan. We can talk more about why I think that if you like in Q&A. But I thought it was a remarkably poor military strategy for the conduct of the war. David Petraeus thought it was a very poor military strategy. Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, thought it was a bad strategy. Gates, the Secretary of Defense, thought it was a bad strategy. And Clinton, the Secretary of State, thought it was a bad strategy. They, therefore, did not present an option for doing that to the president. And President Obama and Vice President Biden therefore concluded, understandably, that they were being gamed. Right? The military is only giving us the options the military wants to execute. Well, that passing in the night in 2009 generated bad feelings that stayed with this process throughout. And if you're going to negotiate a settlement to a war, especially after you've withdrawn a lot of your forces, by the time the Obama administration left office, we've gone from 100,000 troops in Afghanistan all the way down to 8,400. Right? That was in 2016. Right? It's been a long time since we've got 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, right? If you're going to negotiate a settlement with no more than 8,400 troops in the country, you need a very close interaction of the way you're using the remaining military instruments and your negotiating strategy for bringing about a bargain. The military and the political leadership have to be very tightly integrated if you're going to pull off that triple backflip dive. And we had nothing of the kind. The civilians and the military didn't trust each other. They thought they were bargaining against each other in a zero-sum game to get what they wanted. They did not see themselves as being on the same team. And that, I think, made the likelihood that we were going to get a successful negotiated settlement radically lower than what it ought to have been and what we should have hoped that it would be. We therefore did not get such a settlement. Instead, the Trump administration lost patience, not an organization that's much known for their patience, and agreed to a sellout deal in which we would get out. The Biden administration, which I think should have abrogated that deal on the grounds that the Taliban had violated it, chose instead to respect it and withdrew rather than continuing the negotiations. And the result is the Afghan military, once they thought their support and especially their airstrikes had left, collapsed. And that has left us in the catastrophic state that we find ourselves in now. So anyway, that's one of the more important reasons why I don't think failure was inevitable. I think a negotiation strategy was plausible. It could have brought about a better outcome. We did not, because we didn't choose to prioritize it. And instead we decided to simply to leave. And now we're going to get a chance to run the great social science experiment and see what happens. And I think there was a better way than that. With that, why don't I stop lecturing and go to Q&A and turn this into a conversation so that we can ensure that we're talking about the aspects of all this that are of greatest interest to all of you.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Miyako, and I'm the club administrator for the DC-based area club. We have about 9 questions already coming into the Q&A, so already generating some discussion here based on the first part of your talk. So everyone, again, if you have any questions, go ahead and feel free to type them into the Q&A, please, not the chat, into the Q&A. That way I can go through them. So
I just can't help noticing that Miyako has a cello in the background. This is the only
noticed that you did too.
Cello alumni talk I've ever seen. Good for you.
Great. Okay, so I thought maybe we could start kind of where you left off. So we have a question from David who says that the Taliban, who in the Taliban would have been ready, willing, able to abide by a negotiated settlement, especially if ISIS-K had broken off at that point. So even if the Taliban had negotiated and everything went as well as it could have been, ISIS-K probably would have already kind of broken off.
Yeah, I mean, we use this singular noun, the Taliban, to talk about the people opposed to the government. And of course, it's an oversimplification. The Taliban has always been a collection of factions, even before ISIS-K broke off. And so there was reasonable concern for quite some time that the two principal and a variety of subordinate factions, the two principal factions being the Quetta Taliban, the successors to Mullah Omar, and the Haqqani network, basically an organized crime family. There were concerns for a long time that they wouldn't be able to make a deal stick, that even if we reached a negotiated settlement with them, the fighting wouldn't stop because their writ wouldn't run, their word wouldn't be good. And yet, there were a series of ceasefires, often organized around the Eid holiday in Afghanistan, in which their writ ran. The plenary leadership, the Quetta Taliban, announced that there would be a ceasefire, and the shooting actually stopped and stayed stopped until they said it should start again. Now, ISIS-K is another problem, of course. I mean, in settling a war of this kind, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to reduce the war to the splinter faction alone. The scale of this problem and the magnitude of its threats to American interests or to Afghan lives and property would have shrunk dramatically if the only people still in the field militarily was ISIS-K, being opposed by the entirety of the Afghan government military, by the United States aid and airstrikes and support, and by the Taliban. Right? And so the reasonable ambition for the talks is to set up that problem, right, in which the people left standing when the music stopped, ISIS-K, were opposed by everyone else and by the Pakistanis, which wouldn't literally end the violence, right? ISIS-K would still be setting off car bombs here and there through the country, but on a much lower scale than they will be now, because they would have been opposed not just by the Taliban, but by the Afghan government and by American help. And I think that would have been an ambition worth pursuing. I think that could have radically reduced the violence. I think that could have radically reduced the likelihood that base camps get established in Northeast Afghanistan for toppling the government in Islamabad. I think it would not have created, Switzerland and the Hindu Kush, right? It wouldn't have created Gates's Valhalla, but it would have created a tolerable outcome. And in a situation where interests were real but limited, an acceptable outcome is the right way to think about what we were after. And for me, that would have been an acceptable outcome. It would not have been perfect peace and security in Afghanistan, but it would have been radically better than what we had and radically better than what we have. And I think is the end point to which policy should have been directed.
And even when the Biden administration came in, the Taliban had already started reneging on their agreements in what they had agreed to with President Trump, right? So if we had come to a settlement with the Taliban, there's a question here, could they have been trusted to live up to it, even if the Biden administration had tried to work to them? And if they didn't, what would be our leverage against them to have them stay in the agreement?
The leverage is the key point here, right? Because no sane person would simply trust the Taliban to hold to an agreement, right? As the Reagan administration put it a million years ago, trust but verify. So there would have had to have been monitoring and verification procedures. And then the enforcement provisions of the deal would centrally have been about the distribution of aid, right? As is prominent in the news coverage of the country at the moment, right? Afghanistan is utterly dependent on foreign aid for economic survival. And the Taliban have always understood this. A big part of the reason the Taliban were negotiating with us is they wanted a deal that would keep the international aid flow going. They understood at some level that if they took over by military force, the aid was probably going to stop. And they would face the economic catastrophe that they're looking at right now. They clearly wanted the international aid flow to continue and perhaps even expand. And the way you keep them obedient to the deal is by turning the tap off if they don't. right? Written into the terms of the deal would have been aid provisions that are contingent on the Taliban observing a series of requirements, and there would have been an existing government that we would continue to support that would have been in a position to monitor their behavior. And there probably would have been internationals present on the ground also to help monitor their behavior. And if they rearmed, if they went back to warfare, if they set up exclusionary areas in the Northeast where the Pakistani Taliban could set up base camps, if they did any of these things, then we turn off the aid. Or we redirect it so it doesn't go to them. That's the enforcement mechanism. And again, I think there's reason to believe that if the deal was otherwise in their interest, right? If they had a power sharing arrangement such that they thought they were getting a substantial amount of political influence in the country and the ability to compete for more at the ballot box, if they think the deal is basically a good deal from their perspective, then the conditional use of the aid flow is enough to keep them in a deal that they think is basically giving them a lot of what they want anyway. And that's what enforcement would look like. And no, it would not require that we simply trust them.
So we have a question here from a former board member, and she says, I think you must have said that the Afghan army maintained a stalemate on their own. And so she asked, how can we say that when the US was very critical to this effort? There was air support, including the Moab bomb that we dropped, and forces advised and trained the ANDSF shoulder to shoulder, fighting in the insurgency basically on a daily basis.
Oh yeah, clearly it wasn't on their own, right? There were American troops there that were just withdrawn that caused the collapse. If I said on their own, it was a slip of the tongue. At the US troop level went, kind of fluctuated over time. It was at 8,400 when the Obama administration left office. It briefly went up to something probably in the neighborhood of 15,000 when Trump briefly decided he liked war making in Afghanistan before he changed his mind. Then it went way back down again. So it's kind of up and down at times, but the American airstrike contribution was clearly very important to the ability of the Afghan military to sustain that stalemate on the ground. They weren't doing this on their own, right? They didn't own those F-16s, and they didn't own those drones or those F-15Es. That was being provided by the United States. That said, the main contribution of the American military presence was maintaining the combat motivation such as it was of the Afghan military in the field, right? When the Afghans thought that the United States was staying, then they were confident that other Afghans would stay in the field, and the motivation of those troops to maintain that slowly decaying stalemate was sufficient to maintain a slowly decaying stalemate. When we withdrew that was enough to trigger a remarkably rapid collapse of Afghan combat motivation and the presence of the Afghan military in the field. So certainly it was not Afghans alone, right? The Afghans were bearing the vast majority of the cost. Right, the casualties they took in this war exceeded ours by more than a factor of 20, but they weren't doing it alone ever, and certainly not in the end game.
Okay, great. So we have a couple questions. We actually have about 22 questions in the queue right now, so I'm going to start combining them, and maybe we can have a little bit shorter answer just to try and get to a lot of them, because we have about half an hour left. So we have a question from Lavino Johnson, who says, you spoke of the will of the Afghani military not being motivated to fight and them understanding their situation with regards to cronyism. So do you think the ecological environment posed upon the Afghani military, lack of payments, lack of education, extreme poverty, lack of, they're worrying about their family being safe. So are these variables that impact the Afghani soldiers' will to fight against the Taliban? And then we had another question kind of on that. The fact that maybe our natural allies in Afghanistan were the middle and upper class Afghans, not kind of the poor people who were the vast majority of them. And so is there kind of this ill will that we're partnering with the upper class? And so it's kind of that culture clash.
Yeah, I think the central problem with combat motivation in the Afghan forces was not that they hated us. It was that they did not trust their chain of command to keep them alive. Mm-hmm. When you don't think that your leaders care enough about your survival to keep your unit at full strength, to keep the equipment running, not to sell the ammunition and the fuel and the water and the spare parts, to plan intelligently your patrol. I mean, these are the things that persuade the Afghans to not go out on patrol. Afghan attitudes towards the United States are complicated, right? The incidents of what was called green on blue killings, where Afghan soldiers killed American advisors, was disturbingly high. That said, the reason the Afghan army wasn't going out on patrol to protect their country from the Taliban wasn't that they hated us. It's that they thought it was too dangerous because they thought their own chain of command wasn't taking basic precautions to keep them alive in the process. The flip side of that is that the Taliban was not immensely popular either. Right? There's a view among many Americans that the Taliban are this authentic, genuine realization of Afghan national identity. Afghans are an extraordinarily heavily opinion-polled population. And in no opinion poll I have ever seen in 20 years in Afghanistan have the Taliban ever polled above 25%. Right? There are parts of the country, especially the rural Pashtun South, where they're more popular. There are other parts of the country where they're radically less so. If you had asked, if you'd done a comparative poll, who do you like better, the Americans or the Taliban? We would have won that poll hands down. That doesn't mean everyone liked us. Obviously, that wasn't true. But it means there were lots of people who didn't like the Taliban. Right? So winning and losing this kind of war isn't about making the indigenous ally like you. Right? This wasn't a popularity contest to see whether Afghans like Americans or not. Right? This was a war to determine who would govern Afghanistan. Was it going to be the Taliban, or was it going to be Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani and their government? We don't have to be loved for our ally to win that war. But we were more loved than the Taliban in important parts of the country, even so.
Well, Machiavelli might disagree with you on that point, but okay, so we have another question here about Russia and China. So I think this one's really interesting as the US is pulled out now. There's some talk around Russia and China's dealings with the Taliban. So do you think that they'll bring results? This is a question from Sergey. Says, in particular, if the two countries are closer to Afghanistan than the US, potentially the threat to them could be bigger, both in terms of a terrorist threat in Central Asia, where Russia will have to react, and in terms of a possible disruption to China's BRI.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians and the Chinese have national security interests in Afghanistan that are real but limited. Right? It's not an unfamiliar problem in light of the American problem in the country. Given that, they've both been hedging their bets for a long time by maintaining a relationship with the Taliban, but not going whole hog all in with the Taliban. And they're adopting a stance now that's not radically different from that. They're trying to maintain relations, but they're not offering to rescue the Afghan state and underwrite financially its survival. Right? What they're doing is kind of is a version of what everybody else is doing, albeit with more presence in the country. They're kind of watching and waiting and trying to see what's going to emerge. My guess is that they will be potentially helpful interlocutors, perhaps, who knows, with the Taliban government. But I doubt that that either of them really wants Afghanistan as a client state at this point. The odds that they would be able to rescue the country and ensure its stability, I suspect, look daunting to both the Russians and the Chinese. So I think they're kind of hoping that this all works out, that the Taliban stabilize the country, that it becomes possible to export minerals and other economic assets from the country, and that they can exploit that and get in on it, and that the Taliban will prevent terrorists from taking lives in Moscow or in the Uyghur parts of China. But I doubt very much that they're confident of those things. I think, like everybody else, they're going to watch and wait.
And I'm not as caught up on this as I probably should be, but have we frozen their assets abroad?
They meaning the Taliban?
Yeah, or Afghanistan. I thought they had reserves in other countries that have been frozen that they can't have access to.
That's right.
Basically, it's 3 sanctioned countries then at this point. So trying to like have a separate club where they can be together out in the US.
Yeah, I mean, we have not recognized the Taliban government. So, you know, economic assets housed outside the country of Afghanistan owned by the Afghan government, right? We've frozen because we don't recognize the Taliban as the Afghan government, and therefore they are not authorized to have access to those funds. Now, what the Biden administration is doing and what the EU is doing and what a lot of the rest of the international community is doing is they're hoping that that will be leveraged to get the Taliban to moderate. Mm-hmm. So that there's a difficult dance being danced at the moment where nobody wants a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan, but nobody simply wants to open the spigots back up, give the Taliban access to the capital and foreign banks that the previous Afghan government enjoyed, or the aid flow, more importantly, that the previous Afghan government enjoyed, because we don't have a lot of leverage to get the Taliban to moderate their behavior. This is all we've got. We don't want to starve people and kill people, but neither do we want to incentivize the Taliban to become the kind of government they were back in the 1990s. It's a difficult tightrope walk to pull off, but that's what our government is doing. And again, I think the Russians and the Chinese are in a not horribly dissimilar place on this.
So we have a question here from Daniel Bort, who asks, what was the Afghan government's long-term goal?
Meaning the Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani Afghan government?
Yeah, I'm assuming so.
I think their long-term goal was survival. Especially after the U.S. Invaded Iraq and convinced Hamid Karzai that we didn't really have his back. Right, Hamid Karzai thought prior to 2003 that the United States was going to be behind him. And then the United States lost interest, went and invaded another country altogether. And all of a sudden, Afghanistan dropped off the American president's radar screen. I think when that happened, Karzai realized that he was kind of to a greater degree than he had hoped, he was going to be on his own. And therefore, his objective set is maintain an internal balance of power, will keep me alive and in office. And in the long term, I'm sure he hoped that eventually Afghanistan would develop economically and that the country would prosper and that become some kind of Asian tiger in South Asia, who knows. But I don't think leaders in those kinds of settings have the luxury of doing a lot of long-term thinking. I think they have immediate threats to their personal survival that they need to focus their attention on. And the management of an internal balance, as complicated as Afghanistan's, is a full-time job. Ghani was horrible at it. Karzai was quite adept. Ghani was not. Part of the reason that the military collapsed on Ghani as rapidly as it did, in fact, is because Ghani had done a poor job of maintaining the internal balance. And there were lots of warlords that were fed up with Ashraf Ghani, and their allies in the national military were fed up with Ashraf Ghani. Managing that is a 80-hour-a-week job. Worrying about the future development of what your country will look like in 2073 is a luxury that I don't think either Hamid Karzai or Ashraf Ghani could really afford.
So we have a question from Rhonda Small. First, she says, thank you so much for laying out this history. You're the first commentator that she's heard clearly say that since the Taliban abrogated their responsibilities under the Trump negotiated settlement, Biden should have voided the deal. So why do you think that Biden proceeded to pull out under that timeline of the settlement as if the Taliban had lived up to it? And how much has Biden's pullout impaired the international standing of the US and potentially opened us up to increased military challenges by China and Russia?
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question properly, I would need a Vulcan mind meld, right? I can speculate about what President Biden's motives were, but short of this thing, I can't give you a 100% confidence answer. To be honest, my speculative guess would be that he was just tired of this. I think he was personally frustrated with it. I think he was tired of it. And I think he had just lost patience with it. Because it can't have been domestic political calculation. Right? I mean, and this was knowably a bad domestic political move before it happened. Right? A variety of folks like me were saying before this that no one is paying any attention to Afghanistan 8 months ago. The only thing you, President Biden, can do to get this war on the front pages is withdraw and run the risk that there's a collapse. A collapse will be newsworthy. It'll put this on every newspaper in America. Alumni groups at Columbia and Harvard will be holding talks about it. Everybody will, and it will be bad for your approval rating, which has done that. Now, it's not entirely because of Afghanistan. The COVID crisis has played a role as well. But a professional politician of Joseph R. Biden's skill could not have done this as a domestic political calculation, right? If so, he should be impeached for domestic political incompetence, and he's not domestically politically incompetent. He didn't do this from some calculation that was going to be electorally advantageous to him, because it couldn't be. If this had worked out brilliantly, it would have had no effect and nobody would have been paying any attention to it. All it could do is downside. There was no upside. That wasn't what was going on. So I think it was just personal frustration with the war, is my own view, right? And because he was surrounded by plenty of people advising otherwise.
Had the public turned against the war, though? I thought I had seen some polling that said it wasn't really popular from the U.S. public point of view.
Oh, the public had turned against the war by 2009. Right? The public support for the war in Afghanistan has been in a long, slow decline for a long time. But the issue here is not opinion, it's salience. I mean, so classically, these polls will ask two questions. One is, should the United States stay in Afghanistan? The other is, of the following 10 issues, which do you want your elected officials working on in the next 12 months? Afghanistan typically rates 12th out of 10 on that list. Nobody was paying attention to this war except people like me in places like this, right? There were no torchlit marches on the Pentagon. There were no protest movements to get us out of Afghanistan. Congressional offices got no mail on this. You would need an electron microscope to detect the effect of the war in Afghanistan on any congressional race in the last 10 years. Right? It's just been politically invisible. So yes, the public, when asked, says, Afghanistan, oh, are we still there? Oh, we should get out. Right? But it's not anything that was changing anybody's vote on anything. It was just, to a remarkable and unfortunate degree, right? It's not a good thing for democracy to be waging a war that's this invisible, right? It's just normatively inappropriate, but it is the fact of the war. And what that meant is that for a long time, Afghanistan has been essentially a vote of conscience for every American elected official. There's no meaningful public pressure on any elected official to do this or to do that about Afghanistan. They can do whatever they think is best. I think this is what Joseph Biden thought was best. I think in his gut, this is what he thought was the right thing to do. I think that was the wrong call. But if I had to make a guess without a Vulcan mind meld, that's what my guess would be.
And are there some final lessons that you think that the American military and policymakers have taken away from this collapse? Do you think it might affect how we pursue kind of our international security policy going forwards?
Well, I think it's early in the lesson drawing process. I think the lesson that's likeliest to be drawn is don't wage counterinsurgency. But I don't think that's a lesson that's we're at liberty to draw or not, right? We didn't wage counterinsurgency because we chose to. We waged counterinsurgency because these wars were, the Afghan insurgency was forced upon us after 9/11. We didn't wage counterinsurgency voluntarily in Iraq. We invaded the country, destroyed the national military, took over the capital, thought we'd ended the war. We didn't say, hey, let's go get involved in a counterinsurgency. Right? It happened to us because the enemy chose it, not because we chose it. So our freedom to stay out of these kinds of conflicts is not unlimited. The lesson I would like to see the U.S. military draw from this is that war termination is not about taking the enemy capital. War termination is about negotiating a settlement that the enemy prefers to continued fighting. You do not get an end to the war until the enemy decides that they're willing to end the war. And it's much easier to get to that place by starting talks when you're powerful and you have leverage, rather than waiting until situations like now when you're not nearly as powerful and you don't have as much leverage. I would like to see the US military stop viewing war as a football game and start viewing war as Clausewitz did. If Clausewitz says war is a means to ends that are political, the politics are what the war is about, the answer to that should be negotiate early and negotiate often. Use military force as a tool in a negotiating strategy, and don't just put it off until mañana and figure eventually the State Department will sort out something or another. The role of the lesson the US military should take away from this, and I say this as somebody who studies military issues for a living, right? It's not like I'm opposed to military institutions. The lesson I would like the US military to take away from this is that war termination is about negotiation. So start it sooner. Start it when you've got the leverage. Start it when you've got the advantage. Don't wait until you're disadvantaged.
And what about limited wars? So we have a question about kind of the US is waging these limited wars, Vietnam, Afghanistan. And so do we lose some of that leverage because it's more limited in scale? It's not kind of this full-born, really fast, punch it out like Clausewitz is saying. It's and then how do we lose the war? I guess it's not so much that we lost. I guess somebody else said, we won pretty early on, but then we played this hearts and minds game. And so did we really lose? So I don't know if you can kind of comment on some of those issues.
Karl von Clausewitz would not say that we won this war. Because the war didn't end, right? I mean, we can say if we want, we're done, we're out of here. But the purpose of war is not to win a football game. It's not to capture the Capitol and have the referees declare you the winner so you can go home to a ticker tape parade. The purpose of the war is to bring about a political outcome that you couldn't bring about without the shooting. If you don't get the political outcome, you didn't win. You can call yourself the winner if you want, right? You can go home to your parade if it makes you happy. But if what you wanted was a stable government in Afghanistan that would not be run by the Taliban or by its allies, if that's the political purpose that you were waging the war for, you don't win unless you get that outcome. I mean, it's not like there's a scoreboard where you get points for destroying enemy tanks and not having them destroy yours, and you win if your score exceeds theirs. You win if you secured the political purposes you waged the war for. We had not secured them in 2001 to 2002 because the Taliban retreated across the border into Pakistan, built up an insurgency, and took it all back. That's just a lose, right? There's nothing about the war in Afghanistan that should be in the win category. We had a lot of advantages earlier, which we could have used to settle the war, but we didn't because we didn't think we had to. We thought we were too strong. We didn't need to negotiate with these, beaten, defeated Taliban. And we didn't understand that war doesn't end until both sides decide it's ended. If one side wants to keep fighting, the war isn't over. And you don't get to declare yourself the winner and withdraw and go home unless you're willing to let the political outcome you fought for go away. If that's your idea of winning, then fine, you can declare yourself the winner and go home. That's not my idea of winning. That's not Clausewitz's idea of winning. That's not, I think, most military theorists' view of winning.
So we have a question on the offer of the Taliban to surrender to President Bush. I don't know if you could talk about that just a little bit.
I think it's a very interesting issue, right? I think in many ways, looking back on it now, the best opportunity to settle this war was in 2002, right? The Taliban were interested in terms. They were interested in a settlement that would have given them something, would have legalized them as a political actor. And we turned them down and refused to negotiate, right? This is part of the reason why I think the lesson we should learn from this war is negotiate early and negotiate often. Wars are about politics, and politics are, You achieve your political objectives, ideally through some sort of negotiation. If we had said in 2002, fine, you are going to be a legal political party in Afghanistan. You can run for office if you want. We'll let you set up a political office, but we're not giving you anything more than that, right? We're not going to throw you in jail, right? You're legal, but if we see you carrying arms, we will throw you in jail. No weapons. You're going to disarm and be a political party in a pluralist Afghanistan. My guess is that what they were indicating at the time was that they were open to something like this and were looking for some kind of offer like that. And we said, no way. We gave them the Heisman and we stiff-armed them. And I think that was the best opportunity to end this, to actually secure the political objective we were after of a pluralist government that would not simply be run by the Taliban. Because they weren't any more popular in 2002 than they have been since then, right? They were unpopular at the time. The odds that they could have taken over the government at the ballot box was zero. But they wouldn't have been in jail, and that would have been probably pretty close to enough for them at the time. So I think that was the best opportunity we've had. Now, was it politically realistic that the Bush administration was going to do that? No, right? The American public was angry. Bush was angry. Right? It probably wasn't going to happen. If it had happened, it would have produced a much better result. And therefore, we should learn from that experience going forward. And heaven forbid, if we find ourselves in a situation like that again, we should not make that mistake again.
So in our last kind of 9 or so minutes here, I'm going to try and get in a couple more questions.
Sure.
So we have a question on, as we're looking forward now, how can the world prevent a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and ensure that the population receives food and medical care, but without strengthening the Taliban?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can, actually. If we can, it's going to be through sending money to NGOs and not the Afghan government. So the approach that the UN is starting to take, and the approach that I think the Biden administration will gravitate towards, is we are not going to allow money to go through the Taliban because we are not willing to empower them until and unless they make concessions that they have not been willing to make. But we are willing to put Western NGOs on the ground and fund them. So, the World Food Program or the UN refugee operation. There are a variety of mechanisms by which Western money can flow to Afghans without going through the Afghan government. And my guess is we will try to put together something like that. The problem is it's very unlikely to be enough, in my view. So I think Afghans are headed for a great deal of suffering in spite of those efforts. I don't think that the Biden administration could survive politically if they said we're going to send foreign aid to the Taliban government. Right? Whether you, on ethical grounds, whether you think we should or shouldn't, that's just politically impossible in the United States and in a lot of other countries as well. The realm of the possible is in some kind of direct funding of NGOs that are not the Taliban government. But there are limits on how much you can do with that, and hence there will be a great deal of suffering to come.
So one question I find interesting theoretically, if we had a political governor general in Afghanistan, so someone like a MacArthur post-World War II in Japan, would that have had maybe better results combining both the politics and the military?
Perhaps. I mean, the problem in Afghanistan after the Taliban fell was there was not an intact government that had enough institutional capacity to deliver services and stabilize the country. We ended up relying heavily on Afghan warlords, the people who'd been, the Taliban had never completely taken over the country. At their peak, they controlled about 85% of the land area of Afghanistan. They were still waging war against non-Taliban warlords in the country, especially in the north. That's how we got in 2001. Our special forces were inserted into territory that the Northern Alliance, this collection of warlords, held. So we ended up relying heavily on those warlords, to provide security around the country. If we had been willing to make the investment and had done something like a government of occupation, it couldn't have worked out any worse, right? So it might have been worth trying. The concern in the Bush administration was that would be viewed as a foreign occupation. It would spur an insurgency. We would become seen as the enemy, and the country would rise up against us and throw us out. So they were unwilling to do that. They also didn't want to spend the money and the resources because they had ambitions in places like Iraq and elsewhere in waging the war on terror as they conceived of it at the time. But I think surely, I think it's almost certainly the case that some greater level of investment early would have been a good idea. Whether that would have been a military government or something else, I suspect probably something else would have been better. I think a more systematic support for the Karzai government, for example, would have been better. But it would have required more than what we did. I think Douglas MacArthur version 2.0 would probably not have been my preferred design for that. But what we did certainly wouldn't be my preferred design. It would be more than what we did.
And one last question here. Do you think that we should recognize the Taliban government as legitimate? And if we do or don't, how does that play into how the Taliban in Afghanistan affects the situation in Pakistan for the future?
So I'm all about leverage. Right? If we want to improve the lives of Afghans and reduce the scale of danger and destabilization of the region, we're not going to get those things just by asking nicely. We have to create an incentive structure to make it in the Taliban's interest, to modify their behavior at the margin. Right? We don't have enough leverage to turn them into, George Washington in funny hats. Right? We don't have enough leverage to turn them into Hamid Karzai. Our leverage is limited to changes at the margin, but I think we have to use what leverage we have to create an incentive structure to move things at the margin in a more helpful direction for Afghans, for South Asians, and for the United States and for the West. And one of the tools at our disposal is recognition of that government. Now, at the moment, it's politically impossible for the Biden administration to recognize the Taliban, regardless of what the Taliban do. But in the out years, after things calm down some, then you could imagine the United States negotiating for recognition if in exchange the Taliban agree to do A, B, and C. We're not going to fund them. We're not going to recognize them. Whether you think that's a good idea normatively or not, it's just politically impossible. So it's not on the table. But eventually, we do have some leverage with respect to things like funding NGOs. The Taliban want that to happen because they don't want people to starve to death under their watch. We will have leverage eventually with respect to things like recognition and things like supportive a Taliban seat at the UN, for instance, downstream, right? Once things calm down, if things calm down. But in the near term, none of this is plausible at all. In the out years, it's leverage that we should use to try and improve the situation at the margin to the limited degree that we can.
All right, well, we have just a couple of minutes left. So I was hoping, of course, here we have lifelong learners, our alumni groups. So if you could suggest authors, podcasts, shows, kind of anything just to keep the conversation going once we leave tonight. And then if you have any closing thoughts.
Well, I think the two books I would recommend first would be Thomas Barfield's Authoritative History of Afghanistan, which does a number of very important things, including demonstrating that Afghanistan has not been a perpetual snake pit, right? That the country was actually stable and was tolerably governed and not a threat to its civilians or to its citizens or its neighbors for most of the 20th century. So I recommend Barfield's history. I would also recommend a new book by Carter Malkasian, America's War in Afghanistan, which I think is at the moment, and probably for quite a while, the definitive one-volume treatment of the American war there. I think Carter is one of the most insightful, thoughtful scholar practitioners in the US foreign policy elite at the moment. And it's an excellent book, and commend it to one and all. I would recommend podcasts if I listen to podcasts, but as you can tell from my hair color, right, I'm a Luddite, and I do things like, you know, read dead tree books rather than listen to podcasts. I'm sure there are brilliant podcasts out there, but I'm a poor guide to them.
All right, and any last thoughts for us tonight?
If you're people of faith, pray for the people of Afghanistan. They need it. They're looking at a very, very dark winter. And they don't
well, maybe I can lighten it just a little bit. We have an alumni who works with the group, the IRC, which is helping to resettle Afghan refugees in the US, including close to us in Baltimore. So I'll send out a link tomorrow. They're looking for some goods to furnish housing for the refugees. So there'll be some information there. Hopefully it's giving a better life to hopefully some who may get here. Please do.
I have long supported the IRC. I think they're an outstanding organization. I would encourage one and all to seriously consider, you know, helping on this.
Great. And we did record this event, so it will be posted on our YouTube channel tomorrow, but we will also send out the link the same place that we had all the information in today. We'll include that link to the IRC information, and any other questions, of course, can continue to come to our inbox. Thank you so much and have a great night, everyone.
Thanks for having me.